I'm the library director here at the Island Free Library. Welcome to our author event. I'm going to start with a few thank yous. I want to thank the friends of the Island Free Library. I always thank them because they do so much for us. But in this particular case, they built this lovely patio, which gave us outdoor space to do these events. And so I thank them, and I thank you if you are a friend of the library, and if you're not, you could join on and we could extend this lovely patio to do even bigger events. I'm going to thank the staff because at the library here it's always a team effort, so many thanks to the staff. I'm going to thank Susan Bush from Island Bound Bookstore for, it's not very often that she says no, and I'm always thankful that she says yes to me, and so the books are for sale there, and many thanks to Susan for bringing them. I'm going to thank my son in a particular way because he kind of was asked to do a favor for someone over summer, and he moved some people into their new Block Island home and sort of started a friendship with with newcomers to Block Island, and that's how we got this author. That's the roundabout thank you to my son. He said yes to this favor. I actually got dragged out of bed to help with the moving favor, but that's okay because in the end, those people said, hey, my friend is coming to Block Island and you should have her do a book event. I'm sort of notorious for always saying yes. It's not very often that I say no to things here at the library. I say yes, let's try it. And so Julia texted me, it was early one morning, I said yes, and she didn't even include her name or the title of the book in that text. But lucky for me, I'm a yes person, and I said yes, and I texted back after I Googled a little bit about Lady Bird Johnson and the most recent biography out. I said, are you Julia? And then she said yes, and here we are. So I'm very glad you all came out. Please welcome me, and please join me in welcoming. Now here's another funny thing. I said I'm just gonna flub an intro. She's a hotshot. Hello everybody. She's a hotshot. Like when you Google her, she's I saw like the national librarian, the country's librarian introduce her at the National Library. Yeah, look at her in DC. I'm not the National Librarian.
To me you are.
But when I heard him say her name and I tried to practice it and I couldn't quite get it.
But he mispronounced my last.
Yeah, is that why I couldn't get it? Yeah, and so then. Yeah, great. Give it a try. Close. So then I heard her say to someone inside, and I said, "Oh, I didn't quite get that." And she said, I said, "Really?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna let you try." So please join me in welcoming Julia Sweig.
Excellent.
And we're live. We're being recorded. Isn't that fun?
Well, Kristen and Sue, is the mic on?
No.
Okay.
Now.
Kristen, Susan, let's move it closer. How about that? Great, okay. Well, thank you to all of you, staff and library and bookstore and Block Islanders and our friends who are in Washington who put this all together. I'm really happy to be here, and I will share with you that because of COVID, this is actually only the second live event I've done since the book came out in March, and there have been dozens and dozens of Zoom events, but this is only the second live event, so I'm really happy that you all came out in person to talk with me tonight. This is a strange topic for me in a way because I had a past life writing about Latin America and Cuba and foreign policy and working in the foreign policy arena in Washington and New York and all over Latin America. And this is a pivot in a way, but I'll explain to you how it was that I was drawn to Lady Bird Johnson because it's a little bit of an odd turn. And then I'll give you a taste of why I found her to be just so enormously significant. And the title of the book, Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight, really summarizes that surprise. I, after working in foreign policy for so long, wanted to write about, broadly speaking, about the topic of women and power. In foreign policy, there aren't many women at high table and not many of them in power. And of course, in the American presidency, we still haven't had a female president. It's not that I was drawn to the theme of first ladies so much, but in Latin America, I had known and interviewed and been around several women who had come to be heads of state. So this topic generally attracted me, and when I discovered that Lady Bird Johnson had kept her own tapes while the Johnsons were in the White House, 123 hours of recorded audio documenting her experience in the White House. That just sealed the deal for me, because I'm kind of an archives geek, and the idea of discovering unexcavated material about somebody in such a recent period of American history was just spectacular. And moreover, she was married to the American president of the late 20th century, maybe most associated with the word power. And once I started listening to her, and her first entry, and I recommend it to all of you, her first diary entry, and I might be speaking loud because I'm trying to speak over the music. Yes. Was recorded about her experience of November 22nd, 1963. And she starts as capturing with incredible detail and emotion and drama that day in Dallas. And she takes her recording all the way through the end of January 1969. And she recorded in the White House, she recorded on the road, she recorded on the ranch in Texas, she recorded in little motels in the middle of the country, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and began to have those recordings transcribed before she even left the White House. She was a journalism and history major at the University of Texas in Austin, and her sense of the importance of documenting her experience and documenting Lyndon Johnson's political career and her role in ultimately in shaping it and in both its successes and its failures. That was something that by the time she came into the White House, she was completely clear of the significance of the discipline of recording those diaries. So I was very surprised, to put it mildly, once I really got into the material.
Yeah, if you can just is that okay? Yeah.
How about
Just a little, or yeah.
how about if we move it here?
Okay. Does that work?
How's that? I was very surprised to find out just the extent of her own power and her influence as LBJ's strategist and advisor, and her own ambitions for his White House years. The book largely covers the White House years, although if you read the book, you'll hear that it also gives you a taste of her early childhood, a woman who, as a young girl, lost her mother and was raised by nannies who were descendants of enslaved Americans, who had a kind of larger-than-life father whose brothers were away at boarding school, who found herself alone a lot and took enormous solace in nature and in reading and in music. So I'm fast forwarding, but by the time she gets into the White House, she has already been in politics for 30 years with her husband. She's a complete Washington animal. Despite her appearance of being kind of this stuffy Texas politician's wife, tight and coiffed and frozen in expression, she was this very skilled reader of the room. She knew how to assess who she was talking to very quickly. She could work the rope line like nobody else. And so when she finds herself becoming First Lady as the result of the assassination in Texas. Although she says she was unprepared for the role, that's an example of her kind of skill at self-deprecation. She was totally prepared for the role. And LBJ relied on her totally to speak plainly to him and to help him manage his very, very roller coastery emotional inner life and outer life. The first clue that I discovered about Lady Bird's influence came in a document that I discovered in the LBJ library that was sitting in a folder called Letters Mrs. Johnson to President Johnson. And it really isn't a letter. It's a 9-page document that I renamed myself called the Huntlin Strategy Memo. She wrote it in Huntlin, Virginia, at Huntlin, which was in Middleburg, Virginia, at a moment in May of 1964 when all of the Johnsons' ambitions for civil rights and for the Great Society and the war on poverty were moving along, but kind of still stuck in Congress, where the pressure from the Kennedy War Council to escalate the war in Vietnam was growing and growing and growing. And LBJ and Lady Bird, the two LBJs I call them, were looking ahead at the November 1964 election, and he was really questioning whether he should run at all. He didn't think that even if he won, he had the capacity in many different ways to keep the country unified. And he asked her to write out the pros and cons of what he should do. Should he run? Should he announce that he was going to just be a caretaker and step out before the November election? And she did this. She took on board the domestic issues that they were managing at the time, the foreign policy issues, the principal one being the pressure to escalate in Vietnam. And she concluded in her document to him that he should run. She said to him, you'll very likely win, and anyway, you're too young to step out of the arena, and I don't want to go back to the ranch with you and watch you drink and smoke too much. So stay with it. And then in February or March of 1968, you can tell the country that you won't be running for a second term. And of course, we all know that that's precisely what he did. He announced on March 31st, 1968, that he was not going to run for a second term. And at the time, and really since, in almost all of the history that's been written about the LBJ presidency, the spin on that was that it was Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy and the Vietnam War and the tumult in the country in American cities that had just destroyed his presidency and compelled him to step out. But in fact, he was pursuing a strategy that the two of them, that Lady Bird, had laid out for him almost 4 years earlier. So that was the first surprise, to see how much he trusted her, her clarity of thinking, and then to watch the diaries as they unfold, track that decision and implement it. Starting in about 1966, 67, she begins to work on Lyndon about exactly when he's going to tell the country what is the right time and how will you do it and when are we getting out. And part of the reason that she wanted him out was because she didn't think he could survive another term. His father and brother and uncles, had died of heart disease by the time they were 60, and he was 56 at the time that he announced he wouldn't be running again. She wanted him to be alive. They were family people. They were starting to have grandkids, and she then did have the idea that going back to the ranch with Lyndon would be kind of nice. Not in 1964, but by 1968. That sets the frame for me of understanding this woman and her influence and her significance and her ambition. Then over the course of the book, and because of the vast amount of archival material supporting the tapes that she recorded at the LBJ Library and the Library of Congress and throughout American archives and interviews that I did, the other couple of things that surprised me, and I'll talk about those surprises, and then I'll land on Vietnam a little bit and read a section of the book, a short section, and then I hope to entertain your questions and try to answer them. The additional surprises. One was her understanding and commitment to leveling the racial playing field in the American South. When she came into the election period in 1964, once they had decided that they in fact would run again, and I say they, and she slipped once and referred to the presidency as our presidency. So I've kind of internalized that, and I think of it as their presidency, which I think is accurate. Once the Civil Rights Act passed in July of 1964, they moved into full-on campaigning for the presidential campaign against the election against Barry Goldwater. Lady Bird was, of course, from East Texas, but she had grown up spending her summers in Alabama. She understood the Deep South. She was of the Deep South. Her family members to her in Alabama, her mother's side of the family, adjacent to the county where Harper Lee grew up. Similar period of time, too. She took their reticence, and that's putting it delicately, their antipathy toward the concept of civil rights and abolishing Jim Crow and voting rights. She took all of that, the intensity of their feeling, as a very important indication of how tough it was going to be to win the South. Not just electorally, but ideologically and culturally. And she decided, nevertheless, that in the 1964 campaign, she was going to lead a campaign through the South on behalf of civil rights and her husband. And she, how are we doing?
We're good. People in the back can hear the national as well. But if you want to come forward, can we take a 1 second break?
Absolutely.
Everybody take their chair and come this way. You won't hear that. It's much better up here. Or anybody who wants to. But keep going, Julia. Thank you.
So her commitment to the South, to civil rights in the South, was heartfelt, but at the same time she was irritated by the way the Northeastern elite had pinned Lady Bird and Lyndon as you know, these kind of corn-pone hicks, and she worried that kind of attitude was going to make it a lot harder for the Democratic Party to bring the South along, perceiving themselves to be scorned by the North as the Johnsons were themselves. So she went into the South in October of 1964. She traveled through 42 cities in 8 states over 4 days. And as she went farther and farther south, starting in Alexandria, landing in New Orleans, and she encountered a really horrific, just tiny indication of what Black Americans experienced all the time. She experienced death threats. Her train crossing the Alabama-Florida border had to be beefed up with ultra security because there were Klan-related threats against her life. She was tough as nails and understood that she was safe in any case. And I think sometimes her affect was a distraction from her progressive nature and from the commitment that she had to civil rights. Much later in the presidency, as the backlash by white Americans and the demand for more from Black Americans intensified, she became increasingly alienated. She felt herself to be a progressive, but she didn't quite understand why from all corners there was such a rejection, really, of the Johnson White House. In the space where she was able, I think, to realize more of a bringing together of who she was and her ambitions, has to do with her environmentalism. Her environmentalism was often called beautification, which was a word that was prissy and femmy and feminized, and the effect of using that word, I think some was to diminish the seriousness and the scope of her ambitions. And we think about Lady Bird Johnson as associated with flowers and beautifying Washington, D.C. And of course, those of you who have lived there or live there now, and that's me too, we see the tulips and the daffodils and the flowering shrubs every year, and that's gorgeous. But Lyndon and Lady Bird, as I mentioned, were Washingtonians for 30 years, and Washington in the 1960s was the largest black majority city in the country. It was also a city that was completely disenfranchised, didn't have its own representation, well, still really doesn't, but they were big backers of what at the time wasn't called statehood, it was called home rule. And in that, after Brown versus Board of Education, one of the things that happened in Washington, D.C. was a kind of draining of resources for public recreation and public parks in the District of Columbia, because whites left and they went to the suburbs and they took their resources, and Lady Bird had been a lifelong swimmer, and she was really, it's getting difficult for me to project above, but I'll make the point very succinctly. She focused on Washington, D.C. as the model for the rest of the country, wherein what she was trying to do was bring together the idea of access, democratic access to nature for Americans living in cities, especially communities of color who had most recently been most affected by the urban renewal programs in the 1950s all over the country, which included a big part of Washington, D.C. and Southwest. So working in partnership with some very experimental and interesting landscape architects, trying to mobilize money from the Department of Interior, from philanthropists, radical philanthropists, by the way, in New York, she tried to make Washington, D.C. that model by focusing on the area, the park area along the Anacostia River, which was very segregated. And for her, she with Stu Udall and Walter Washington, who then became the first elected mayor of Washington, tried to open up to the actual residents of Washington, D.C. in this part of the city. Now, this was a very ambitious plan. It was something she hoped to take to the rest of the country, but it was also very expensive. And once Lyndon Johnson, at her pushing, decided to not run again, the vision that she had for D.C. sort of crumbled with his presidency. But I think today, if I were to be asked, what is her most important legacy as regards the environment, I see it and hear it now in a discussion that we're having about access to nature for all Americans, not just in national parks, but in American cities. We think of highway beautification as her thing, but this matter of the urban spaces was far more important to her and much more difficult in many ways. The last thing I'll talk about is Vietnam. The thrust of what I've written about and talked about, you probably hear it almost as a little bit more, perhaps more positive and about the Johnson administration, given that administration's ownership of the debacle that the country experienced, in my view, in Vietnam. Lady Bird, when it came to Vietnam, completely shared the blinders that Lyndon Johnson had about it. And they weren't blinders in a willful sense, though. Both Johnsons were idealists who were fighting the battle of the Cold War, and the idea of losing any one of those battles abroad took them back to the darkest days of the prospect of losing to fascism during World War II, or to communism during World War II. But also, they were idealists in the sense that they believed that it was possible to project their own successes domestically to the other side of the world. So if you could bring electrification to rural Texas, why not to the Mekong Delta? And it wasn't really until 1967, when their two daughters had spouses who were getting ready to go to Vietnam, and when her travels around the country to campaign for a pretty sophisticated environmentalism were drowned out totally by anti-war protest, that she really began to have a shift when it came to Vietnam. But for most of the first term, or the only term, it was a subject matter that she was totally on board with her husband around, and I think it's one of her weakest spots. But I tried to give you some context to explain why that was, and I'll read you, just to conclude, just 2 paragraphs from my book, which has to do with the early period, back in 1964, right after the Civil Rights Act had passed, and the Johnsons were having a big state dinner in Washington, D.C. for the Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant. This was also right at the time when Lyndon Johnson was trying to maneuver Congress into supporting a much greater escalation in Vietnam. And the combination of civil rights triumphs and Vietnam undertow pulling them down is what I want to capture at this moment in August of 1964. Kristen, is this okay for me to read this? Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay. Well, the first sentence is going to be funny. It fell to the First Lady to introduce the evening's entertainment. The cultural tides had yet to shift against the White House, but the choice of one of the country's leading folk groups to serenade the Warren peacemakers could not have been more laden with significance. Civil rights activists already, and still unabashedly enthusiastic about Lyndon Johnson's legislative muscle on that front, Peter Yarrow and Paul Stookey, with their slim bearded faces, looked like minor modern prophets, and Mary, in an Empire crepe gown fashioned with puff sleeves, with her long, uneven, golden chopped bangs, looking like a slightly rakish princess, better known as Peter, Paul, and Mary, performed for the 142 guests. The group, whose music later became synonymous with anti-Vietnam protest songs, had a history of ties to the Democratic Party. They'd performed at a fundraiser for JFK at the D.C. Armory in 1960 and become friendly with the Johnsons after accepting an invitation to the after party hosted at their home. Despite the intense focus on Vietnam among their audience that summer evening, Peter, Paul, and Mary did not intend for their playlist 4 years later to make a political point about the war. We were not troubled by the surrounding events of the Gulf of Tonkin. Vietnam had yet to penetrate our consciousness as the debacle it was about to become, Peter Yarrow explained. The group performed Puff the Magic Dragon before the song became a popular reference for both marijuana and napalm. But of all the songs the trio performed that night, it was their cover of Bob Dylan's chart-topping Blown in the Wind that most resonated with Lady Bird. The song was first released a week before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom of the previous year, and the trio sang it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as a civil rights protest song. A year later, just a month after the Civil Rights Act passed, singing the song at the White House for them marked a celebration of progress by Lyndon Johnson, not protest against him. But for the audience and for Lady Bird, the trio had conveyed an entirely different message that evening. The next day, the First Lady recorded into her diary a quote from a press report that, quote, every one of the 142 guests sensed the winds of danger now blowing around the world from crisis-torn Vietnam. It was, Bird recorded with unease in her voice, a very haunting song, perhaps an omen, she felt, of what was yet to come. The next day, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, authorizing President Johnson to use military force in Southeast Asia. So, I'm going to just let it sit there, and please, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
born on Halloween, passed on Halloween, last Halloween, an Islander. And I officiated my first funeral service on his land. And I did 2 playlists, and one of them, he avoided the Vietnam War. And the first song that I played for his playlist was Blowing in the Wind. So that just took me. Thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you for sharing that.
So effectively about Lady Bird and Jackie's relationship. Could you walk us through that just in a highly appreciated way? Because it's so great.
Yes, thank you. And Marianne is a good friend of mine and has come up to the island with me, and I'm delighted that you're here. She's also read and edited almost every page of this book. Well, the Jackie Ladybird relationship was another wonderful surprise, because in diving into both the material that their interviews and their documents and the stories that each of them told about the transition, the 14-day transition between the assassination and when Jackie moved out of the White House and the Johnsons moved in, showed me what a close and intimate relationship they had developed by 1963. In the 1950s, Lady Bird was the wife of the Senate Majority Leader, so she was the big cheese, and Jackie came into town and wasn't that into politics, and certainly not into hanging with the Senate spouses, but they kind of developed a mutual respect for one another, and Lady Bird was on top. But that all began to switch by 1960 when Jack won the nomination in Los Angeles, and the Kennedys, Jack asked LBJ to join the ticket as vice president. It was a huge power move, and it killed the Johnsons. They couldn't see a way not to say yes. They did say yes. Lady Bird had a talent for making herself totally indispensable, and that's what she did with Jackie, who didn't campaign much during the presidential campaign, but Lady Bird was on the road 35,000 miles, almost every state in the Union, campaigning as Jack's surrogate, as Lyndon's surrogate, as Jackie's surrogate, schlepping Rose and the daughters to Texas and all over the South. She was absolutely vital, and she did that for the team. She was a full-blown member of the Johnson campaign and then of the administration. The relationship with Jackie, though, shifted a bit after Jackie moved out of Washington, D.C., and especially after the tension between Bobby Kennedy and LBJ grew increasingly open and palpable, where Bobby's ambitions and the prospect of having Bobby best him was just too much. So by the time, and I'll wrap this up, by the time Bobby Kennedy is assassinated and Lady Bird and Jackie find one another at St. Patrick's Cathedral at Bobby's funeral, the relationship has really taken a difficult turn. And if you do read the book, please read that far, because it's kind of an incredible, again, thanks to Lady Bird documenting it in real time, we can hear just how difficult that moment was. But they repaired the damage, and in the 1980s spent time together every summer when they were both on Martha's Vineyard. I wish I had been a fly on the wall there. Yes?
I was lucky enough to hear you on your interview on NPR, and who were there on stage about how you felt about Jackie just after Jack's assassination, on that plane, watching her the born as president.
Yeah, I think powerful is definitely the word. And thanks for coming tonight, having heard me already once. I appreciate that. Uh-huh.
Over 30 years ago, I had an opportunity to meet Liz Carpenter, who was Lady Bird's chief of staff.
Yes.
Before that, I think Johnson's communications person at the time of the assassination. So I know Liz's son and daughter-in-law, actually daughter-in-law's a friend. I'm curious, when people are in leadership or very public positions, the people that they choose to be around them really makes a difference.
Yeah.
What's your sense of the relationship between Lady Bird and Liz Carpenter?
Marianne and I were just talking last night about Liz Carpenter. Somebody needs to write a book about her.
She wrote her own.
She did write her own, but yeah. Liz Carpenter was also a Texan and also a journalist, although she worked as a journalist for many, many years before. She was just the word dynamo almost doesn't really do it justice. But she met Lady Bird when Lady Bird was running Lyndon's office, when Lyndon was serving during World War II. He was away in the Pacific in California. I'm not sure he was actually up in arms, but he was away, and Lady Bird was running his office, and Liz came to Washington, D.C., a young cub reporter, and what do you do when you move to Washington? You knock on your member of Congress's door. And the two of them just became very tight ever since. And Lady Bird and Lyndon had this Texas and Washington crowd of people that were constantly in and out of their apartment and then their house. And Liz and her husband Les, who had then started their own news service, were core to that. To your question, I think Lyndon Johnson had an incredible eye for picking people that he surrounded himself with, and many of whom stayed for many, many years, and Liz is one of them. He was not afraid to have strong women tell him what to do. Now that's a kind of, you don't think of that with Lyndon Johnson, right? He's this big, tall Texan, and God knows his vulgarities and his infidelities don't suggest that he's a person that can take it as well as he gives it. But Liz Carpenter, I think of her as sort of like Valerie Jarrett in the Obama White House, where she played this role of helping to knit together the politics of the East Wing and the West Wing. She was one of the only people other than Lady Bird that could speak real truth to power. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. It's been fascinating. My question is, what do you think of Robert Caro's portrayal of Lady Bird?
Thank you for asking the Caro question. What I think is that it's, I don't see evidence that he spent the time to listen to her material and dive into it and incorporate her story into the way he tells the story of the Johnson presidency.
That's why we're glad to have this book from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, LBJ is a huge character, and if any of you have ever been to the LBJ library or any presidential library, you know that the archival material is just so overwhelming. So for somebody that's devoted his life to telling Lyndon Johnson's story, and he's now in his upper 80s and finishing his current volume, it took me 6 years to do this book, just to get my arms around all the material. So I want to be careful to say that, Robert Caro is a gorgeous writer, and his history has been essential. But it's not the whole story, and I think historians were involved in an iterative process, and we find new material and reknit the story, and that's what I've tried to do by putting Lady Bird Johnson in the room where it happened. I saw somebody's hand somewhere. Sure, and then I'll come to you. To escalation. to escalation. There had been this incident in the Gulf of Tonkin where the North Vietnamese had allegedly, but maybe, but probably not, but we're not really sure, attacked some American warboats. There was a kind of low intensity, the North Vietnamese at the time were trying to assert their power, and and Lyndon was trying not to get sucked in at that time. But he was also, domestic politics are always so important, and part of him felt that he had to placate the hawks in order to get his domestic agenda through. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is basically a resolution by Congress that gave the White House at the time a lot more authority to escalate the war in Vietnam.
And it was because of the fact that it stayed escalated for so long that they decided not to run again.
Well, that was one element, of course, but the key thing about that I started talking about at the beginning was that the two of them had decided that he was only going to run for one term, serve for one term in any case, well before those body bags and that escalation and that intense anti-war protest movement sealed the deal. Yes, I'll come to you in a
I'm just wondering if there's another public figure that has caught your imagination for your next book.
I'll repeat the question. Is there another public figure or somebody else that's caught my imagination for my next book?
All revealed here.
No, well, I'm open to suggestions. It's really tough to find the next figure because I was so lucky to land on Ladybird. All that unexcavated material, all the Robert Caro ink spilled that didn't include her, the story of the 1960s and race and war and upheaval, it was just, I don't know how I'm going to find another character that has that much to offer. So I'm open to suggestions. I'm going to be doing a lot more audio, though. I know that Kristen's advertisement also wrote about my podcast that I did about the Lady Bird story, and I will be doing more audio while I figure out what my next book is. Maybe not a 6-year endeavor, though. Yes, Linda.
I was in Washington for 64 on, and I must say that most of what I remember about the Johnsons was from a Swedish Easterner, a Northerner, and I'm amazed at how deeply you have gotten into so many things that I got wrong. And I was living through it, and I was reading the Washington Post, and it didn't matter. Every time I ride through Rock Creek Park in the spring, I say, "Thank you, Lady Bird."
And she deserves those things.
But that's the only thing I've ever thanked her.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to say thank you because that's a really high compliment. I really appreciate that. Part of the reason you didn't get the real story, though, in real time, wasn't because you weren't doing the hard work of seeing it. It's because the reporting was focused on telling a certain kind of narrative, but it was also because Lady Bird was concealing how involved and influential she was. She kept this record, but it wasn't released until pretty recently. She was a woman of a different era. It wasn't going to be the case that she could be quite so open and out with how much power and influence she wielded. Lyndon probably wouldn't have liked it, although he talked about it a lot. But nobody would have believed it, and it would have just upset the gendered apple cart of the moment. So that's another reason you didn't see it, and it wasn't reported, because it was actively concealed.
Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Is that generational? That concealment?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah, it's the
Absolutely.
time. It's the time.
Yes.
Lincoln's mentors were Southern segregationists,
Yes.
Rayburn and Russell and whatnot, and how did their relationship with her, and did they try and placate them?
Here I'll refer you to Caro, because he covers the ups and downs of his relationship with Richard Russell really well. Rayburn and even Russell, and Russell was opposed to the civil rights legislation. Rayburn died before it really took off, but both of them continued to treat Lyndon as sort of as Lyndon's mentor. Even when Russell was violently opposed to the civil rights laws, he was advising Lyndon to stay out of Vietnam. Lyndon had the latitude to call Dickie Russell about lots of concerns that he had quite apart from their battle over civil rights. He cultivated these men very well from the very beginning when he came to Washington. Yes?
I would like to talk a little bit about your personal relationship.
Sorry, how she felt about, I think I know what you're saying, but,
Infidelity,
oh yes, uh-huh.
philandering.
I'm really glad that you asked that question. As we'd say at Passover, glad you asked that question. Because one of my other motivations, I mean, not at the very beginning of the process of writing this book, but certainly once I got into all the secondary literature and the way the story has been told, was to kind of pull the curtains back on what was really going on there. How did she really feel? And I took my cue from her. I came across a letter, not of the full letter, but a quote from the letter that she wrote to somebody else that was writing about her. And she cut off the relationship with this writer because she said, because the writer was focusing too much on the infidelities and the philandering. She said, "You'll never understand me unless you understand how totally intertwined Lyndon and I are." And I decided to take that at face value. But one of the things that I think is really important is that the emphasis on the philandering and the infidelity by people like Caro and others deprives Lady Bird of agency, and it assumes that she's just Lyndon's victim and his doormat. And I'm not condoning the philandering, but I'm simply saying that the totality of the marriage was so much more than what was happening in that field of it, in that layer of it. She had an enormous amount of power with him and over him, and I'm sure she was very hurt by it. But I think early on, she figured, well before they were in the White House, she figured out exactly who she was dealing with it, and they made their, or I don't want to use the word arrangement, but they came to some kind of terms around it. That's where I landed on it. And there's some stuff in the diary that scratches around it that surprised me, where she speaks about one of his former lovers kind of weirdly admiringly, spending a morning with her and how brilliant she was, and she spent the night in the... So I won't give away the whole story. It's in the book.
Cliffhangers.
Anyone else?
Well,
Nope.
I have one.
Yeah,
And I know you're, first of all, my apologies. Who knew the National would do music after Labor Day? I certainly did not. And I didn't think it would happen on a Tuesday night, so I apologize. I did get them to turn down the radio, but the performer I didn't have control over. So
No worries.
my apologies to you, Julia.
None.
But I'm curious, and maybe I missed this in the beginning when I was dealing with that music, but what was your leap? Because this isn't the first thing you've written. You write about Cuba and foreign policy and Latin policies, and so what was the leap to Lady Bird?
Oh, you missed that. Yeah,
I did
didn't
miss
talk
that. I'm
about
sorry.
that. Oh
Yeah.
no problem. I'll
Yeah.
repeat it. I mean,
Okay.
I wanted to write about women in power. I mean, I personally had sat in the room being, for years and years, one of the only women in the room in all of these foreign policy discussions. And I just, it sounds kind of like a cliche now, but over and over and over, watching a certain dynamic that was kind of driving me nuts. And I needed to just pull back and find somebody that I could maybe learn from in terms of how they navigated a dynamic like that. I mean, this is kind of looking backwards, but I wanted to write about women in power. I didn't have a topic. She left all of this material that none of the other LBJ historians had incorporated into their storytelling. So it's just kind of a, she found me. I found her. So that was the leap, and also, but just not even anything to do with that. I was intellectually kind of done writing about foreign policy in Latin America, and I had worked very hard for many years on Cuba and the opening with Cuba that is now shut down. But once that happened, I felt like I didn't really need to be working in that field anymore. I mean, I just wanted to learn something new, and I did, which was lucky. And I was very lucky to be able to do this. Sure.
I'm curious, maybe this is going off mark here, but her relationship with her daughters during this time. I mean, their lives were very public. The girls were getting married. What does she have to say about raising daughters?
Well, so much. I did not interview the daughters. I asked them to sit for interviews with me, but that did not happen. And as you say, they were very public figures, and they continue to be very, what they say about their parents is of a certain vein. I think they felt a little stung by Caro, actually. But they also, I'm not directly answering your question, but I will. I did, Lucy Johnson, I met her once at the very beginning of this process, the younger of the two. And she said, well, Julia, how would it be possible for anyone to write, do you think you can write a book about my mother that isn't at the expense of my father? Because they're worried that Lady Bird's the saint and Lyndon is so easily demonized, and that, and I said, well, yeah, I think I could do that. I don't know. So, but kind of like the Obamas too, once they moved into the White House, then they were all under the same roof all the time. And there's a lot of Lady Bird talking about her relief at having much more access to her daughters. After the assassination, Linda moved from Texas back to Washington, and when she went to GW and lived at the White House, and a good friend of hers moved into the White House. So there was a lot more family time, and it was really the first time now that Lyndon was president where Lady Bird could just kind of like hang out and snuggle and gossip with her girls. And she writes about that quite a bit. And then put on these ginormous weddings for both of them, which was a bit of a overstep. Well, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thank you to you. This was really fun. Wonderful questions. I'm very happy to have had the chance to have a live event with all of you.
Susan is here with books. Julia will sign them. Thanks so much for coming. Have a sip of wine. Have a glass of wine. Have a cookie.
Thank you for that.
Oh, we forgot to ask.
Actually, I was just gonna I was gonna ask the whole crowd if anybody was driving or preparing to report Friday morning.
Oh, good. They're all
She drove us. I know. Okay, so I'm gonna take a seat here. And here's our camper. Okay. Well, no, what's You're very welcome. Got it. And you know each other. You know I'm going to remember that. That's what I said. Sorry, I missed it. Oh, I know, but I have to focus because I'm going to screw up a little bit. That's what she just spoke about. My brother said it's about women in power, right? If you so I'm actually and I'll make a comment. Okay, so I write this down. Or whatever, right? Then I'll make a comment. Thank you for coming. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for coming. No, exactly. I mean, I think if you really like him, you had a microphone so his entire life with him. If you're going to throw yourself to somebody, you're going to like them.
What sticks in my mind?
I said something. Yeah. Yeah, right? It's brutal.
Thanks for letting me share. Now I can let it go. Yeah, that was good. Now you can go talk about that.
You can take teacher, thanks for coming. Yeah, this is fun. It's just weird. I really am sorry. For her friends, where she's staying, yeah, she moved them in. Yeah, she got connected with them. For sure. Then his friend. Yeah, good. Take it, let you go. I don't know. Not with the big, not no, or any power, it could be any power. Yeah, any power. But
Thank you very much for bringing that water.
no, I'm not going to that one. She's a wonderful woman. What's your name? Thank you for that. Oh, yeah, that's definitely. You, Janice?
This one is
And I asked. There's a and I
to sign the 3 copies I've got left for the bookstore?
I'd love to. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Kristen, this is how we do it. Kim.
Kim, and I'm Susanna.
Dates out. Put them in your pocket for tomorrow.
Yeah, and it helps.
Well, I'd have to have a book, right?
There's no reason you can't talk about some of the other books you've read.
Oh, that's okay.
You know, there's nothing like back catalog to keep,
If
people
you think
interested.
that's interesting, I would be happy to do that.
I think for a certain crowd it would be.
That's awesome. Okay.
Thought she was coming when she did it. Thank you for coming. Yeah, did Susanna get us one? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. It was great. Yeah. Yeah. Yay! Thank you. That was great. Yeah, that was good. I have to say, that last night, I was at town council meeting, and I speak in something else. There's some show like that, and the corner speaks is like, manager says, we gotta get you a microphone. We gotta make sure everybody can hear you. Exactly what you talked about. Yeah, and I'm like, it's not. It's 2021. 2021. You gotta get him a microphone. Oh, but the other council member says, I have an extra. I'm like, next time bring your own. But I have to tell you, someone came in today and said to me, she can hear you even without a microphone. They brought me to the library to tell me that. And I was like, oh, can I have, Sure. course I'm coming. What are you
I will.
doing until then? You can have a seat.
You can read a book.
You can read a book. We're open till 7. I know.
We got a book to read.
You need help with chairs or anything?
Oh, we're good.
Because we have to hang around for an hour.
Saving room for
Jamie.
saving room for my daughter.
Oh, okay. You're of that generation.
And I'm on dock seat.
Oh. It's the first thing everyone.
Oh, I can. Oh, in that case, I'm getting some wine. My daddy says it doesn't affect it.
Did you drink?
Yeah, he's had wine like 4 or 5 times.
And that's one of the first.
You know what? Knock on wood.
He has a martini and goes gardening.
You're a scientist, right?
No.
No, I'm giving you extra degrees.
Although I do have a master in science.
Okay. So you're not like, you're not working with like,
No, historic preservation. But material degradation.
anyways, I only, and I feel like I was thinking of that time again, that how long? And I'm trying to think about it. That's how we roll around here.
Well, you're around here all the time. How come you get it?
Oh, okay, now you sound like my family now. You never go outside. I'm like, I'm not
Well, I was told.
Don't do
Everybody's
anything.
like,
We got lots of stuff.
had wine before? Because I'm constantly in the.
Know it, but.
No, I wouldn't have known that. Not every history before. Yeah.
My daughter has had it.
And, but I'm always in the out there, and I'm always moving things off.
by the way. By the way.
Yeah.
Well, I've been tired all the time, but I don't know if it's a disease or old age. Anyway, thanks for this.
Oh, yeah, that's.
Oh, here's Sarah. Don't crush him here.
We like to, keep you all happy.
Those get stacked. Well, we're doing fine. I am fine. I can't go outside until I work, so I need exercise. So I've been getting exercise. So
If you want to stack it, you can.
are these coming? They're all coming in.
Yeah. Okay. How'd it go? Did you guys make a lot of rainbow things? Yeah. Oh my God, California! You better watch out for me. I'll be moving in with you. Awesome. I did it. See you later. And your skirt's awesome. Thank you. Not like there, right?
I mean, I'm in the university now. Maybe more going on.
Okay, I felt like there was, I just, for example, I told this, for several weeks now, like, they don't pull up to your bumper at the red light. They're spacing. They're not honking when the light turns green. It's like, I just felt it was really very lovely.
I walk through the streets and,
Yeah.
and there's face time,
Yeah.
which is nice.
Yeah, the whole thing I thought was really, I had a good time. I'll tell you all about it. They do go in. They go. Is it? I guess it's time enough to go in. Yeah. But really, you guys can sit down and enjoy.
I told them that. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen to me.
They're filling time.
Are you from New York? I just got that. I heard that. What's that?
Good.
I just didn't know if he's from the city. The accent.
What accent?
Whose accent? No? No accent? Oh, you don't
Like,
have
why would
like
I
an
notice it?
obvious. Like you don't have an obvious New York accent, but when he's like, go inside, like it was like.
That's funny. I
It
didn't
was
even
cute.
notice it.
Yeah. Well, I don't notice, my Rhode Island accent until everyone points it out often.
Yeah, you don't have a very strong one.
Until I do.
Was it?
They do, but really, we're good. Thank you. We have lots of staff still here.
Yeah, this is our exercise. Our library workout.
Okay, so